The first time my son measured a life in dollars, I was standing over a navy suit and a cooling iron. "It's just a stupid ceremony," Mom Robert said, and the words landed colder than a Minnesota winter. 6 months later, the same son arrived at my door when whispers of an inheritance reached him, palm up and eyes bright. That was the day I discovered revenge isn't rage or spectacle. It's patience. It's a locked door, a steady breath, and the decision to serve consequences chilled to clarity. My name is Dorothy Miller, and 3 weeks before all that, I buried my husband Edward after 42 years of marriage. I buried him alone. The church had been full neighbors, Edward's Navy buddies, forming an honor guard the choir without a single empty chair. But the pew where our only child should have sat remained a void I couldn't stop staring at. Robert had called that morning while I pressed Edward's jacket, the same one he wore at our wedding. He spoke in the tidy tone he uses when feelings threaten to complicate his plans. He had a golf tournament with a $300 entry fee. Jessica had a book club. Funerals don't change the dead. I said very little. Grief can make you loud, but it can also teach you the power of a closed mouth. I ironed the sleeves smooth and told myself I would remember the sound of that click when he hung up. In a small town, you learn to curate your truths. At the reception, I told 20 variations of a lie. Delayed flight work emergency, bad cold each one, scraping my throat raw. The casseroles were buttery, the hymns familiar the rain, polite enough to wait until the last shovel of earth. Back home, the house felt like a museum built by someone who still lived in it. Edwards's mug sat on the counter. His garden clung to late blooms the way a faithful dog insists on waiting by the door. I set his ring in a velvet dish and promised myself I would carry our dignity the way he had carried us quietly and to the end. Then on a bright morning at 9 a.m., a certified letter arrived from Edward's attorney. I knew Mr. Harrison from a lifetime of mortgages and notarized PTA forms, but I did not know the figure that sat in his tidy black ink. Edward had left assets I'd never seen, layered trusts and properties meticulously tended over decades, a sum that read like a fiction I would have scolded myself for believing. $23 million. My hands trembled. My first instinct was not to celebrate. It was to sit very still and listen for my husband's voice in the steady tick of the hall clock. He had planned something. He had planned me into it. By 10:30 a.m., the familiar sound of Robert's BMW pulled into my driveway precise as an appointment. He didn't wait for an invitation the way love does. He stepped in the way ambition does, with Jessica trailing fingers strangling a designer purse, as if guilt were hiding inside and trying to escape. They took the room in like appraisers, the framed Navy photo, the solid recliner, the china plates that had survived more arguments than most marriages. Robert sat in his father's chair without asking. I sat in mine and picked up my coffee, letting the silence whittle him down to size. He mentioned Tom Stevenson Millerville's unofficial post office of gossip, saying Edward's attorney had been trying to reach him about paperwork. Jessica's voice softened into professional sweetness as she used the word assets, and something in me hardened. Assets is a sterile word until it's paired with your husband's name. I asked what kind of paperwork they meant, though I already knew the choreography of their visit, a show of concern, a request for details, a pivot to needs and numbers. Robert said there might be a trust. Might there? I asked. Perhaps I said when a son is not too busy for his father's funeral, he finds out sooner. Robert tried logic the way other people try kindness. He would not have known who was there. I looked at the empty recliner as if Edward might still answer. Your father wouldn't, I said. But I did. It struck me then how grief acts. It presses dignity into your spine. I told them to leave. Come back when you can speak about Edward like a man, not a portfolio. They left the way a storm withdraws angry muttering, promising to return. The next morning, the calls began at 7 a.m., and I let them ring while I buttered toast. When I finally played the first message, Robert's voice wore a new coat of politeness. They offered dinner. They offered to help. Jessica arrived at 2 p.m. with supermarket carnations, dressed as contrition. She stood on my porch and whispered about pressure and mortgage and student loans, and I recognized what she wasn't saying. They had calculated me into a solution. I asked if Robert was in trouble financially. She slipped, then recovered, then slipped again. That is the trouble with practiced sincerity. It's all pearl, no grit. I took the flowers without inviting her in. Financial stress explains bad choices, I said, but it doesn't excuse them. She flushed with offense that looked like shame's cousin, and when she drove away, the carnations sagged in their water as if relieved to have their honesty back. By Friday, a chorus of familiar voices told me Robert was hunting information Margaret at the post office with her crackling drawl, Mr. Harrison's receptionist with her careful discretion. Small towns keep receipts for grace and injuries alike. I moved through the days polishing silver no one would use and reading Edward's letter until the paper grew warm in my hands. If you're reading this, he wrote, "Our son has revealed his true character. Protect what we built. You earned it." On Sunday at 6 p.m., Robert arrived alone carrying a bottle of wine too expensive for a man on the edge. I had cooked Edward's favorites not to reward my son, but to fold my husband's presence into the room. Over pot roast and apple pie, we spoke of work and weather. It felt almost like the evenings before the fracture, except my eyes were older now and the room knew it. When the plates were cleared, I brought out a folder with carefully chosen truths. I showed Robert a modest account, a sliver of what existed and a map of the trust as it related to me. His breath hitched over numbers he thought were huge. He was already dividing a future that did not belong to him. I set my coffee down and told him about Edward's conditions, the ones I believed, even if the wording was mine: honor, respect, family above convenience. He bristled. He argued. He claimed birthright. I held the line. When he raised his voice, I raised only my eyes. When he said I was punishing him, I asked him to define love without attendance. Robert left that night with the brittle dignity of a man who had practiced winning and never rehearsed loss. I washed the pie plates under warm water until the steam fogged the window, then dried them slowly, letting the quiet arrange itself into resolve. At 9 a.m. the next morning, I called Mr. Harrison and asked for an appointment. His office sits in a converted Victorian, where every floorboard creaks like a witness. He met me at 10:15 a.m. with coffee that tasted like caution and slid a thick file across the desk. He spoke of trusts and beneficiaries, of revocable clauses and discretionary power. But what I heard most clearly was permission. Edward had structured everything with me at the helm and a weather eye on our son. He hoped to be wrong about Robert, Mr. Harrison said gently, but he wanted you protected if he wasn't. I told him I didn't want punishment. I wanted a chance at rehabilitation. I wanted accountability to feel like an invitation instead of a verdict. Together we built a plan that was less a trap than a mirror. I would reveal only a fraction of the truth and offer a way forward that required character before cash. By 2 p.m., the phone began its chorus again. I let it sing through the afternoon and into evening. On Tuesday, at 7 a.m., a voicemail arrived with Robert's voice smoothed to silk. By noon, 4 more. At 2 p.m., Jessica stood on my porch with carnations and a smile stiff as lacquer. She spoke about helping with arrangements and lightening my load, but her eyes flicked around my living room like hands. I accepted the flowers and kept the threshold between us like a rule. Grief may be inconvenient, I said, but it is not optional. She stammered and left, and I stood in the doorway for a long time after the BMW disappeared, feeling the strange energy of a house that knows it is being courted for the wrong reasons. On Friday at 11 a.m., Margaret from the post office called to say Robert had been asking about my certified mail. "That boy still thinks charm is a skeleton key," she said, voice crackling through the old handset. "Keys don't open vaults," I answered, and we both fell quiet, thinking of Edward's careful hands, how he could fix a hinge so it closed with a whisper. When Sunday came again, I invited Robert to dinner at 6 p.m. alone. He arrived with an expensive bottle and careful manners, and for an hour we performed a version of ourselves that had almost gone extinct. After coffee, I slid him the curated folder. He stared at the statement $300,000 and caught his breath. He did not know it was less than 2% of the whole, and I did not volunteer it. I explained that the money was held in trust with conditions Edward valued more than any dividend. Honor your family, respect the living and the dead, put duty before convenience. He laughed without mirth, said I was weaponizing mourning, said a single mistake should not condemn a son. "Then show me it was a single mistake," I said, and watched the words push him back in his chair like wind. He left tight-lipped, and the next 3 days stretched elastic and thin. On Wednesday at 8 a.m., while I was watering the petunias, Edward had coddled through late frost. Robert's car rolled to a stop at the curb. He looked older by 10 hard months, not 10 soft years. He came in quietly and sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded like a boy waiting for a grade. When he spoke, the bravado had burned away. Jessica had left the night before. She could not live with uncertainty, he said. She needed guarantees and calendars. I went to Dad's grave at 3 p.m. Yesterday. He added eyes fixed on the wood grain. I told him the truth. I didn't come because I was scared, not of death, of being the son you needed when I didn't know how. He pulled a small brass object from his pocket and set it on the table with reverence. Edward's navy compass dulled by decades and thumb smoothed at the edges. He gave it to me at 18, Robert said. Said to use it when I felt lost. I think I've been ignoring North for years. The apology that followed arrived without the usual lawyer attached. He apologized for the call that morning of the funeral, for the arithmetic that measured a life against a golf fee, for letting convenience wear the mask of reason. I reached across and touched his hand. "Grief doesn't break you because it is heavy," I said. "It breaks you if you refuse to carry it." He asked what he could do now. I told him about Edward's hope, never written as a clause, but spoken into me over a lifetime, that a man could prove his compass by walking, not pointing. 1 year, I said softly, a year of choosing duty over ease service, over appetite, presence over profit. No promises, no payouts, no hints at what waits on the other side. Not because I need a show, because your father wanted a son, not an heir. Robert flinched, then straightened as if discovering a spine under old habits. What would that year look like, he asked. I told him I would not script it. Scripts are for performances. This had to be practice. Keep a steady job. Pay what you owe before you buy what you want. Be where the people you love need you when they need you. Visit your father without a calendar occasion. Show up for your neighbors without the camera of your own conscience aimed at you. Live like the money does not exist and like your character is the only currency you have. He nodded slowly, rubbing its edge with his thumb until it gleamed. Then I'll start today, he said. Not because of a trust, because of Dad. That afternoon at 4 p.m., we drove to the cemetery together. He spoke to the stone in a low voice and let his shoulders shake in the way of a man emptying a reservoir finally mercifully. On the way home, the air felt lighter the way July feels after a storm breaks open the heat. In the kitchen, I poured tea and watched him carry his cup carefully as if every small act were an oath. I want to earn whatever Dad wanted for me, he said, even if what he wanted was a lesson that ends with me having nothing. I felt something unfurl, a hope I had been afraid to name. Then begin, I said. Not tomorrow at 9 a.m., not Monday at 8 a.m. Begin at 6 p.m. when you knock on your mother's door with humility. Begin at 7 a.m. when you wake without dread and make a list that includes someone else's need. Begin at 1 p.m. in the hardware aisle where a stranger asks for help, and you give it without calculating the tip. He moved into his old bedroom that very night, no grand announcement, only a duffel bag, and the compass placed on the nightstand like a star. In the morning at 8 a.m., he walked to Morrison's Hardware and asked for work. By noon, he had a starter wage and a sore back from unloading pallets. He came home at 6 p.m., with hands nicked raw and pride tucked quiet under his fatigue. I made stew. He washed dishes. The house listened. So did I. The months that followed became a kind of crucible. Robert rose at 6 a.m. every morning, laced boots that had seen better days, and walked to Morrison's Hardware, where he stocked shelves and cut lumber for neighbors who remembered him as a boy. At first I watched from the window with suspicion, expecting the performance to falter. But week after week his posture shifted. Pride that once sat on his shoulders like armor began to soften into something steadier. He stopped asking me for gas money, started bringing home his own groceries, even insisted on mowing the lawn and shoveling the driveway without prompting. Part of rent, he said gruffly, though I charged him none. On Saturdays, he began volunteering at the food bank. It was Margaret from the post office who told me first, her voice carrying a mix of gossip and approval. "Your boy carried crates all morning without so much as a sigh," she said, at 11 a.m., one brisk October day. Didn't even stop for coffee. I pretended to be surprised, but the truth was I had already noticed the dirt under his fingernails and the new stillness in his eyes. He was learning how to stand without leaning on anyone's wallet, including mine. One evening in November, I found him in the study staring at Edward's photo. He had taken the compass out of his pocket, tracing the brass like a prayer bead. "I think I finally understand what he meant," Robert said softly. "It's not about knowing where north is. It's about choosing not to ignore it when the easier path points south." I said nothing, only stood in the doorway and listened to the quiet work of a son rebuilding himself. Then life threw its own test. It was February when Jessica appeared at my door at 10 a.m., bundled in discount clothes and looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Her hands trembled as she held out the truth. She was 4 months pregnant, and the child was Robert's. She spoke quickly, desperation spilling into words about unpaid medical bills, fear of the future, and a plea for help. I studied her face and recognized the absence of calculation I had grown used to. She was frightened, but not entirely honest. Old habits lingered like perfume. Robert listened in silence until she finished. "What do you need?" he asked finally, his voice low. She blinked, startled by the absence of anger. Prenatal care, she admitted, and maybe a chance to try again. The old Robert would have leapt at the opportunity to fold money into the cracks of their marriage. This Robert paused, then shook his head. "The money isn't mine," he said, "and even if it were, I wouldn't use it to buy back what you left behind. But I will pay for what belongs to both of us, this baby. That's my responsibility." Jessica wept, and for a moment I felt the sting of pity. But when she left, clutching only the promise of medical help, I saw the resolve in my son's jaw. He was no longer the man who measured value in inheritance. He was becoming the man who measured it in duty. Over the next weeks, I watched him set aside dollars from his meager paychecks, walk to work in worn-out boots he could not yet afford to replace, and quietly cover medical costs without complaint. He never once mentioned the larger fortune, waiting unseen, never tried to leverage it for love. And when Jessica realized there was no immediate wealth to anchor herself to, she disappeared again, leaving divorce papers in her wake. Robert brought them to me at 7 p.m. one night, hands trembling. "She wants me to sign away my rights," he said. "She thinks if I won't give her money, I should give her my child." His anger was raw, but underneath it lay something firmer. "I won't do it, Mom. I won't abandon my baby the way I abandoned Dad." He tore the papers in two, his voice steady even as tears stung his eyes. "This time I'll fight." The fight was costly. For months, every paycheck vanished into legal fees. He sold his golf clubs, the same set he once chose over his father's funeral, to cover the last retainer. He borrowed work gloves from Morrison's and picked up overtime shifts until his back ached. He refused my offers of financial help, repeating the same phrase, "This is my responsibility." At the hearing that autumn, Jessica's lawyer painted him as a man-child who had failed his father and would fail his own. But Robert stood, his voice shaking but unbroken, and told the judge the truth. "I was a poor son," he said, "but I will not be a poor father. My child will never wonder if they were wanted." It took 2 weeks for the judge to decide. When the call came at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, Robert sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Joint custody supervised at first, then equal when the child was older. He cried harder than I had seen since he was 8 years old, but this time his tears fell not for himself, but for the chance to be present in someone else's life. That night, I made his favorite dinner, and for dessert, I gave him the letter Edward had written for the day our son proved himself. Robert read it in silence, tears dripping onto the paper. He knew, he whispered finally, he knew becoming a father would change me. I took his hand. "Your father always believed you could find your way," I said, "and now you finally have." 6 months later, I stood in a room that used to echo with Edward's tools. His workshop had been stripped of sawdust and blueprints and transformed into something softer, a nursery. Sunlight spilled across pale walls as Robert sat in a rocking chair reading "Good Night, Moon" to his newborn daughter, Emma. She was only weeks old, dark hair curling against her tiny forehead, her breath rising and falling with the rhythm of her father's voice. I leaned against the doorway, watching the man my husband had hoped to raise emerge at last. The inheritance had already changed everything, though not in the way anyone in town had predicted. When Robert learned the full truth that Edward's secret estate amounted to $23 million, he did not erupt with greed or triumph. He simply folded the papers back into the envelope and said, "I want to prove I'm worthy of this, not just spend it." It was a sentence I never thought I would hear from him, and it was the moment I knew Edward's gamble had paid off. Robert gave his 2 weeks' notice at Morrison's Hardware, but not before training the boy who would replace him. He bought a modest house 3 blocks from mine, a place where Emma's cries carried across the distance like a bell calling us home. Instead of using the money to drown himself in luxuries, he followed the guidelines Edward had left behind. Together, we established the Miller Foundation, dedicated to helping struggling families stay together, supporting single parents who were trying to build better futures. Robert ran it with the same patience he had learned stacking boxes at the hardware store, the same humility he had earned kneeling at his father's grave. One evening, as Emma drifted to sleep, Robert and I sat in his kitchen drinking coffee. The refrigerator behind him was plastered with photographs, Emma wrapped in hospital blankets, Robert cradling her with awe on his face, and one of the 3 of us together, my hand on his shoulder. In the center hung the last photograph ever taken of Edward at Robert's graduation from the parenting classes he had insisted on completing before Emma was born. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" Robert asked, his voice hushed. He stared at the photo as though waiting for an answer that only I could give. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "He's been proud every day since you chose to fight for your daughter instead of taking the easy way out," I said. "But I think he'd be especially proud to see you using his money to help others find the strength he always knew was inside you." Robert swallowed hard, and when he looked up at me, I saw not the boy who once measured life in golf fees, but the man Edward had always believed he could become. Later that night, I drove home through the quiet streets of Millerville. Porch lights glowed against the dark, and in the distance, I could see the warm square of Robert's living room window. Inside, I knew he was checking Emma's blanket one last time, before turning in the way Edward used to check our doors each night. And I felt something I hadn't felt since Edward's passing peace. It struck me then that the fortune Edward left behind had never really been about money. It was about hidden strength, hidden character, and the hidden capacity for change that lies dormant until tested. Edward had gambled that our son, buried under years of entitlement and disappointment, could still be reached, and against all odds he had been right. The true inheritance was not $23 million, nor even the house that had stood for generations. It was the restoration of our family, the reminder that people can falter and still rise, that love can survive even the coldest winter of disappointment. As I settled into Edward's recliner that night with a cup of tea, I felt his presence in the ticking clock and the whisper of wind through the garden he had loved. For the first time I heard his voice in the silence, gentle and sure. "Well done, Dorothy. Well done." So if you've stayed with me through this story, I hope it reminds you that wealth means little without wisdom, and family means everything when we fight to preserve it. Some lessons can only be learned through loss, but some miracles can only be seen after change. If you found meaning in this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And please share your own story in the comments. I'd love to hear it.